Tonight, we begin with a development that U.S. officials, European allies, and intelligence analysts had anticipated, feared, and prepared for. A rejection that unfolded not over weeks of careful consideration, but in a matter of hours. Hours that stunned Western capitals. Hours that forced Trump's hand. Hours that revealed the true nature of Putin's intentions that many had desperately hoped would remain ambiguous. What Vladimir Putin did today crossed a line that the entire Western alliance had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, President Trump did not hesitate. He shifted strategy with speed, clarity, and unmistakable resolve. But the story didn't end there, because when Washington pivoted, Kyiv responded with something no one expected, an ultimatum. Not from Moscow, not from Washington, but from Ukraine itself. Tonight, we're going to walk through exactly what happened, why it matters, and what it tells us about the dangerous new phase this conflict has entered. Because what we witnessed today wasn't just a diplomatic setback. It was a collision between three fundamentally different visions of how this war should end. And at the center of that collision stands Volodymyr Zelensky, a leader who has spent 3 years fighting for his nation's survival and today made clear that Ukraine will not be sidelined in negotiations about its own future. For weeks now, there had been signals, not official statements, not formal diplomatic cables, just signals that the Trump administration was preparing something unprecedented. A ceasefire proposal that would be presented directly to Moscow through back channels that hadn't been activated since the early months of the war. President Trump has been transactional, yes, but he has been predictable in his transactionalism. His moves have followed a certain logic, a rhythm, almost a pattern. He pushes hard, makes demands, and waits for the other side to blink. But what set off alarm bells in Moscow, Kyiv, and Brussels this week was that Putin's response defied the pattern entirely. Intelligence analysts who monitor diplomatic back channels know the indicators. The careful parsing of language in official statements, the subtle shifts in military positioning, the calculated delays before responding to major proposals, the quiet coordination between foreign ministries, all of that went silent. And whenever Putin goes silent on a major diplomatic initiative, it means something is about to get loud. European officials had been tracking these developments with growing concern. They knew that Trump had invested significant political capital in this ceasefire proposal. They knew he had presented it as a reasonable framework for ending the conflict. They knew that rejecting it outright would be seen as a significant escalation. But what they didn't know, what no one outside the Kremlin knew, was just how definitively Putin was prepared to reject it. Until today. Today they found out. And what they learned has fundamentally altered the calculus of this war. Early this morning, State Department sources detected what they described as unusual diplomatic activity, including communications from Moscow that indicated the Kremlin had reached a final decision on Trump's ceasefire proposal. These are the kinds of signals that Russian officials only send when they are preparing to deliver definitive news. A major policy announcement, a formal rejection, or a calculated provocation. Intelligence analysts didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Putin was about to respond to Trump's proposal. And when Russia responds to a major American diplomatic initiative without warning, even Washington pays attention. By mid-morning, the contours of Putin's rejection began to emerge. And what became clear was stunning. According to sources speaking to multiple news outlets, Putin rejected Trump's ceasefire framework in its entirety. Not partially, not with counterproposals, entirely. The Kremlin's formal response, delivered through diplomatic channels, stated that Russia would not accept any ceasefire that did not include full Ukrainian demilitarization, permanent NATO exclusion, and recognition of all territories currently under Russian occupation. In other words, Putin demanded everything and offered nothing. This wasn't a negotiating position. This was a rejection designed to humiliate. And it came not from some mid-level diplomat, but from Putin himself. The response from the White House tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Official after official, statement after statement described Putin's rejection as provocative, a miscalculation of American resolve, and perhaps most importantly, a strategic error that would carry consequences. But diplomatic language only works if the target hesitates. Putin did not. In fact, within hours of rejecting the ceasefire, Russian forces launched a new wave of attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. Here's what we know. Within 3 hours of Putin's rejection becoming public, President Trump convened an emergency meeting of his National Security Council. Within 4 hours, the White House announced a significant shift in U.S. strategy toward Ukraine. Within 5 hours, new military aid packages were being expedited through Defense Department channels. These weren't the measured, careful adjustments we've come to expect from diplomatic setbacks. These were rapid strategic pivots, the kinds of moves that an administration only makes when it is preparing to escalate pressure significantly. And that willingness to shift strategy so quickly, even after investing so much in the original proposal, sent shockwaves through capitals around the world. Tonight, Pentagon officials confirmed that the Trump administration has authorized the delivery of advanced weapon systems to Ukraine, including long-range strike capabilities that had previously been withheld over escalation concerns. Trump approved the transfer before Putin could consolidate his diplomatic victory. They authorized ATACMS missiles with extended range. They approved advanced air defense systems that Ukraine has requested for months. They fast-tracked F-16 maintenance support that had been delayed in congressional review. In other words, Trump targeted the exact capabilities that would make Putin's military position more difficult. The weapons that would extend Ukraine's reach. The systems that would protect Ukrainian cities. This is what made Trump's strategic shift so significant. Putin's rejection wasn't just a diplomatic setback. It was a miscalculation that triggered exactly the response Moscow had hoped to avoid. And Trump, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. He didn't escalate rhetoric without action. He didn't issue empty threats. He authorized capabilities that changed the battlefield equation. He sent a message that rejection carries costs. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Intelligence analysts now believe that Putin's rejection was designed to test the resolve of the Trump administration after months of diplomatic engagement. Putin wanted to see whether Trump would accept humiliation quietly. But instead, the opposite happened. Trump didn't retreat into diplomatic silence. He announced a strategic shift that was so swift, so comprehensive, that even the Kremlin noticed. You don't get Moscow's attention easily. But today, Washington did. Senior European diplomats speaking with journalists under anonymity described Putin's miscalculation as hubris, an overestimation of Russia's leverage, and an underestimation of American resolve. But Putin proved today that he remains both stubborn and willing to gamble. His rejection was not only definitive, it was coordinated so precisely with military operations that Western officials believe it was planned weeks in advance. That coordination matters because it shows that Putin is not simply reacting. He is executing a strategy. He is attempting to shape the diplomatic landscape even as his forces struggle on the battlefield. And that strategic ambition in the face of battlefield setbacks is what makes this moment so historically dangerous. But the most unexpected development came not from Washington or Moscow. It came from Kyiv. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned that President Zelensky had called an emergency session of Ukraine's National Security Council. Ukrainian forces continued defensive operations along the Eastern Front, maintaining pressure despite Russian attacks. Ukrainian diplomatic teams contacted European allies, coordinating messaging with remarkable speed. Ukrainian intelligence shared assessments with Western partners that shaped the collective response. This wasn't just Ukraine reacting. This wasn't just Ukraine accepting whatever Washington decided. This was Ukraine taking initiative. This was Ukraine issuing an ultimatum. And that ultimatum is the one thing neither Washington nor Moscow had anticipated. For every assumption that Ukraine would simply follow American leadership, Zelensky has countered with something that demonstrates Ukrainian agency. Tonight was no exception. Remember, Putin thought Trump would accept the rejection quietly. He thought the American president would be unwilling to escalate after investing so much in diplomacy. He thought Ukraine would be desperate enough to accept unfavorable terms. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Trump is escalating military support. European allies are coordinating with unprecedented speed. And Zelensky, rather than accepting whatever terms are offered, has issued an ultimatum that redefines the terms of negotiation entirely. What makes this moment so dangerous and so consequential is that Putin's rejection happened at a time when he is under enormous internal pressure. Hardliners in the Kremlin want a decisive military victory. Oligarchs want sanctions relief and access to frozen assets. Military commanders want more troops and resources. And ordinary Russians, increasingly feeling the economic strain, want the war to end, one way or another. Putin is balancing these demands while simultaneously managing a diplomatic humiliation that undermines his image as a master strategist. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. The ceasefire rejection wasn't a sign of Russian confidence. It was a sign of Russian inflexibility, an inability to accept any outcome that doesn't validate 3 years of failed military objectives. And Trump's strategic shift, whether intentionally or not, exploited exactly that vulnerability. It signaled to Putin that Washington will not be humiliated into silence. The formal statement from the State Department, now distributed to all U.S. embassies, was carefully worded but unmistakable. Officials said plainly that Putin's rejection was inconsistent with any genuine desire for peace. That is diplomatic language for, we offered a reasonable framework and Putin chose war. You don't usually hear that tone from Washington unless something fundamental has shifted. And tonight, something fundamental has shifted. The proposal that was supposed to demonstrate American leadership has instead demonstrated American adaptability. The offer that was supposed to end the conflict has instead clarified just how far apart the parties remain. And the diplomatic initiative that Putin rejected has now been replaced by a military initiative that Putin will find much harder to dismiss. Meanwhile, President Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people in a somber, determined speech tonight. He said, "We did not ask for this war, we did not choose this suffering, but we will determine how it ends." He said, "Ukraine appreciates its partners, but Ukraine will not accept any agreement that trades away our sovereignty, our territory, or our future." And he said, "To Moscow and to any capital that thinks Ukraine can be pressured into surrender, let me be clear, we have conditions too, and those conditions are not negotiable." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become. And they represent something new, something that neither Washington nor Moscow had fully anticipated. An ultimatum from Ukraine itself. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Putin's rejection wasn't isolated. Along with the formal diplomatic response, Russian forces launched over 120 missiles at Ukrainian cities overnight. Russian state media began a coordinated propaganda campaign describing Trump's proposal as a trap. Russian diplomatic missions in Europe began circulating alternative narratives designed to fracture Western unity. All of this happened within the same 24-hour period. When Putin moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. He is not simply rejecting a single proposal. He is attempting to reshape the entire diplomatic landscape. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing for a spring offensive designed to capture as much territory as possible before any future negotiations. Another is that Putin is attempting to wait out Western support, calculating that political changes in Europe or America will eventually favor Russia. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin has concluded that he cannot win this war, but is determined to ensure that Ukraine cannot win either, creating a frozen conflict that destabilizes the region for decades. But today, both Trump and Zelensky took cards off the table. Trump didn't accept the rejection quietly. Trump didn't retreat into diplomatic silence. Zelensky didn't accept whatever terms Washington offered. They both responded with clarity and force. And in doing so, they may have changed the trajectory of this war. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Putin wants to see whether Western unity will fracture under pressure. Trump wants to show that American leadership cannot be humiliated. Zelensky wants to demonstrate that Ukraine will not be sidelined in negotiations about its own future. And European allies want to prevent the collapse of the security order they've built since World War II. These objectives don't easily align. And how they're reconciled in the coming weeks will shape not just Ukraine's future, but the future of international order itself. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence officials who are now monitoring Russian military movements with heightened attention. They say Russian forces are repositioning in ways that suggest preparation for renewed offensive operations. They say communication intercepts indicate significant frustration within the Russian military command. And they say Putin's decision to reject the ceasefire is likely part of a broader strategy intended to test Western resolve before committing to any negotiated outcome. But neither Trump nor Zelensky is backing down. In fact, both are consolidating their positions. Trump's strategic shift today, swift, comprehensive, and unequivocal, sent a message to Moscow that rejection carries consequences. And Zelensky's ultimatum sent a message to Washington that alliance does not mean subservience. European officials speaking tonight described the coordination as remarkable and necessary. That's diplomatic language for everyone is finally on the same page. And that alignment may prove more important than any single proposal or rejection. As the night goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve with this rejection and what Trump's strategic shift will mean in practice. But what we do know is that today's developments were significant. They clarified Russian intentions, they demonstrated American adaptability, and they revealed Ukrainian agency in ways that reshape the diplomatic landscape. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the next several days. If he signals willingness to reconsider, this moment will be remembered as a turning point toward negotiation. If he escalates further, Trump and Zelensky have already shown they are prepared to respond. They have shown they are not intimidated. They have shown they are ready to endure. And in this war, endurance has proven to be the most powerful weapon of all. And tonight, for the first time in weeks, the Kremlin appears to be recalculating. Russian state media, usually bombastic and confident, has been notably restrained in its coverage of Trump's response. The usual triumphalism is absent. The usual threats are muted. And when Moscow is quiet, it means they are thinking. It means they are reassessing. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Putin learned something that he should have learned long ago. Rejecting reasonable proposals does not demonstrate strength. It demonstrates inflexibility. Humiliating partners does not create leverage. It creates resolve. And underestimating adversaries does not produce victory. It produces consequences. This story is far from over. The coming days will bring new challenges, new pressures, new tests of will. But tonight, 3 things are clear. Putin's rejection has backfired. Trump has demonstrated he can adapt under pressure. And Zelensky has proven that Ukraine will not be dictated to by anyone. Not by Moscow, not by Washington, not by anyone. We will be here, watching every detail, analyzing every development as the next phase of this historic struggle unfolds.